How do we measure it, and is it good? I think that's something that like a lot of businesses get hung up on. We're going to build a thing that's going to take us 4 weeks, and I'll be like, what would we build if we only had 2? I think founders, when they're building their company, have really good nose for what is good, what is bad. And
That's quite a nice measure, isn't it? Is it something that you could acknowledge someone did? Can you reward the behavior of the value? And if not, maybe it's not a great value. Welcome back to Studio Z. Once again, the mobile form of the studio, because I'm here in the UK, as can be verified by my beautiful Greg's coffee here. British followers will know the value of this brand. I'm actually back at the Incident IO offices in London. They've moved to a beautiful new office. This is a new location in the library. And today I'm joined by Chris Evans, not the TV personality, but the Chief Product Officer of Incident. And we're going to talk a little bit about the culture at Incident you've built and some of your spicy opinions that you have here. And so, Chris, welcome to the show.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Also representing London with my cup of tea.
So, a cup of tea. Milk, yeah. 2 sugars. What's your...
Milk, no sugar, obviously.
Okay.
Yeah,
One of my favourite things was I met a guy from Tetley, which is a tea company, and they had business cards, and instead of saying their job title, it said how they take their tea, like milk, 2 sugars.
Very cute. Very cute. Yeah. Very good cultural little flash there.
It's a little bit of magic.
There you go.
A little bit of magic in the details. Chris, introduce yourself to the audience. Let them know who you are, and of course, give us the quick pitch on Incident. I will say, Zooplo just became an Incident customer, so we're obviously fans. Nothing to do with this podcast. The team didn't know I was meeting Chris. But yeah, we did just become a customer. Yeah, tell us about yourself.
Yes. So as you say, Chris Evans, my background, like I've basically been in software engineering my whole career sort of thing. So I've gone through the ranks of, writing code originally, doing all that kind of stuff, then started leading teams doing that kind of thing. And then to sort of fast forward a whole career's worth of that, ended up running platform sort of engineering teams. So this is people looking after AWS installs, physical data centers, databases, like all the gnarly stuff that kind of underpins most technology companies, right? I was doing that most recently before this company, at a company called Monzo, which is a bank here in the UK. So when I joined them, they had a couple 100,000 customers. Like they were like the tech darling of London, I guess. And then by the time I left, like 4 years later, nearly 7 million. So like huge growth journey there.
So it's a new bank. It's not like one of these. It's not like the NatWest or this is a sort of newish techish bank.
100%. So I think I'm trying to think what the equivalent is in the US. Like a Chime, I think is maybe one, something like that.
No, actually, yeah.
No,
I'll take your word for it.
Well, me neither. So basically, there hadn't been a ton of innovation in banking for such a long time, right? And then suddenly a bunch of banks got banking licenses, or maybe that happened, but like started building these sort of banks, and it was like, how do we build much better banks for people, basically? So it was super exciting joy. It sounds, when you tell people I used to work at a bank, they're like, okay, cool, yeah, big corporate. It wasn't like that. It was like a really great culture startup. Really, so it was always positioned as like, it's a tech company that happens to be a bank. And that switched over time, right? And that, as you grow and you become more mature, it became a bank that also had tech supporting it.
Yep.
But phenomenal journey there. Reason I bring that up is because being a sort of relatively complicated sort of technical product, essentially, had things going wrong all the time. I was responsible for all of the on-call engineers that were sort of staffed to make sure that when stuff went wrong, basically, that we had people around the clock able to sort of support it. And as part of that and trying to make that easier, that whole process, I ended up writing some software in my spare time to essentially like manage incidents a bit better. They were super complicated, basically. So, you can think of like a database breaks, right? And you might go, well, that's an engineering problem. But actually, if the database breaks and people can't use their cards to pay for something in store, it's now a customer support problem. Right. And if enough card transactions fail, you start to sort of fall foul of regulation, and so it becomes a regulatory problem. And so you have all of these different parts here, and so they were pretty complex. And so I wrote some software like laughably simple, but like helped to sort of coordinate some of that like workflow problem, I guess, of an incident. And that was like the early genesis of what became Incident IO, essentially.
So give me an example of the workflow, like make it real. What would happen?
Yeah, a great example, what would be a good one? So like a great example would be, like, let's imagine you have an incident and it's impacting customers, and you're like, I want to update my status page, right? And so there's like the internal workflow of that might be like, well, now I need to coordinate with my customer support team, because updating the status page, the reason you would do that, for example, is to give customers like insight that something's wrong, so they don't go and raise a support ticket. Like if they can jump into the app and they get a little banner in there that says, hey, we're having problems, don't submit a ticket, we'll be back online as soon as possible. You sort of quell that demand, and that sort of stems some of that. So that would be a workflow that the software that I'd written sort of would help with, was like just make the status page a bit easier. Then there's other workflows, which is like, well, the regulators, like if you're going to communicate with your customers and say you're having an incident and it's public, we also want to be notified because we're the regulator and we sort of sit across all of the banks. And that's like, well, how would you implement that? You say, well, engineers, while you're on call, if you're doing a status page, now you have to do that and communicate with customer support. And you also have to now communicate with the regulatory compliance team.
Gotcha.
And so it starts to become like, well, now my job is like admin on an incident, and you can take all of the sting out of those things and essentially go, well, when we put a status page up, why don't we just ping the team that owns the regulatory thing, and now no one has to do anything extra.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like a sort of a tight example, but like that's the kind of stuff that we solved back then. And then with Incident.io, we've sort of, I guess, dialed up to 11 to sort of make much more possible for people to sort of configure on the fly.
Awesome. So I'd love to learn more about the culture you've built at Incident. But before we do, you said something about the culture at Monzo being great.
Yes.
Like briefly, what does that mean?
Yeah, Monzo. So Monzo was like a really great place to work. I think that they had a bunch of values, but they had this one absolute standout value that was like pretty radical and honestly a little bit uncomfortable when I joined the company. And they had this value called default transparency. And the kind of principle behind that was, in a lot of places, like it's totally fine to do things quietly, and like you DM people and you do things like that, and then you sort of decide if you want to make things public. And so it'd be like, well, now we'll talk about it. And Monzo kind of like inverted that, and it was like the default mode of operation for the company was everything would be public. So it was like public channels for everything. You had to have a really good case for doing a private channel in Slack, for example. But it went as far as like email. So if you were sending an email to someone, you had to copy, you had to copy in a Google group of whatever the right context was for that thing. And then anyone in the company could subscribe to that. And it went quite far and wide. Like in the early days, it was like the founders would be communicating with people and copying it into like lists so anyone could see. Obviously, there's like a lens there where it's like, well, there's
HR issues or
HR
something,
issues,
or
someone's doing a fundraising round and you don't want it to bleed out into the company early days.
Yeah.
But people were it was very like transparent, and like funding rounds are a good example, which was Tom used to stand up and give lots of insight to the whole company at all hands before things were like finalized and be like, I'm trusting you with this information. This is like part of our values, default transparency. And as I said, it felt pretty uncomfortable when I first joined in some regards, because I'm like, this is kind of like, I feel very sort of seen here.
Yeah.
And then when I think you actually look at the benefits that come from it, it's actually a phenomenal value. And the value that I'd see there is like essentially the more sort of, I guess like the more active like collisions you can kind of enable around an organization, the more you can sort of spark good input and good sort of like, basically it's like positive serendipity, I guess, which is like, if I communicate with someone in another team in a public channel about something that I'm talking about, there's a chance that someone else can see that and go, oh, I have context on that thing. I've already done it, or you don't need to do this kind of thing. Obviously, there is the downside of that, which is like everyone has an opinion on everything. And that was something that Monzo had to sort of like navigate here, which was like, default to transparency doesn't mean you have to read everything. And it did sometimes feel like drinking from the fire hose. Yeah, exactly. But I think it's like, you put the onus on the individual to be like, what is the sort of sensible set of things I should read from?
So I've worked at some places that talked a lot about this. Like Facebook, actually, certainly in the earlier days, was very transparent. Like famously, like Zuck chose an office that was glass all the way around, and you could see in. I know there was another meeting room he went to for certain matters, right? But no, you could see what was being presented on the screen. The idea of the emails all being shared is pretty wild. So it's interesting from just a point of view that it sounds quite scary, but how do you think it actually changed behaviors on a sort of, on a, let's say, micro level of an individual? How did it change your behavior? Did you think more carefully about what you wrote to those emails because it's going to be shared? Like, what were the benefits on a more detailed level?
Yeah, I think like, I guess the downside, when I first joined, like, it's pretty nerve-wracking, right? You join a company and you're like, I'm, trying to prove that I'm good and I'm doing these things and like everyone can see everything, and it's pretty exposing. But I think it very quickly, it's sort of like, it's quite hard to pinpoint, right? Because it's like, it has to have the right set of culture around this kind of stuff. That it's sort of like, it's dovetailed with trust, I think, is the other thing, which is like, I have to be able to sort of be transparent, but trust that people are assuming I'm doing the right work and I'm doing things with good intentions and all of those sorts of things. And I think Monzo did a very good job of like dovetailing those two things together.
Got it.
So essentially, like, I think at the micro level, like, as I said before, like the things that were really, really positive from it were that like enabling those collisions of different people and perspectives. And this was something that I think was really good in the early days and ended up sort of hurting a little bit in the longer term, which is Monzo also had this kind of like principle of like, first principles thinking, which is like, hey, we are not going to apply the banking playbook to build the bank here. So a great example is like Tom read the entire like banking regulation doc back to front. And so when people would come in and tell him what he could and couldn't do, and Tom's the CEO, I should have said, he's one of the founders and CEO. He read that, and so when people would come in and go, "Oh, you can't run a bank in the cloud," like no one had done that. Everyone would run on premise, and he's like, "There is literally nothing in the regulation that says you can't do that." And so it's like it's quite powerful to have that, and the more information you have, and the more sort of that stuff is
real challenger mindset, right? Let's just accept the norm.
100%.
Yeah, I love that in the culture. Actually, that's one of the things I learned more in America, to be honest, than the UK. I think it's like very built into the exceptionalism of the US and folks.
For sure.
Right? It's like really built in. Okay, awesome. Well, let's move to Incident then and talk a little bit about the culture there. I mean, I'm just going to ask directly on this since we're talking about this. Did you just copy this default to transparency culture, and do you have the email thing?
We don't actually. We don't have the email thing, and that's predominantly because email is such a minor feature in how we communicate these days. Like Slack Connect's become a thing, and so pretty much any company that we want to communicate with, we have public channels that are Slack connected into them. So that works really nicely. But we did copy that. We did copy that value, and we had that sort of all of the things. It just felt very natural. The three of us who founded this company all came from Monzo. And so, start the Slack workspace and everything will be open, and Notion is like all public pages, and we do things in, open there, so it's like freely available for people to consume. So we have copied that. We haven't actually got default to transparency as a core value, which is a mistake, and we can get into that if that's interesting at some point. But we sort of do by proxy of the fact that it's a lived thing, but it's not written on the list of values.
Sure, which is real culture anyway, isn't it? It's like what you do, not what you've written down on the poster. But
Exactly.
So you have a set of values then. Do you want to go through some of them that you have an Incident now?
Yeah, can do. I guess like maybe worth talking about like where they came from, because it's like I think like every single company has a set of values, and if you were to sort of publish them on your homepage or whatever, I think they're very easy to tear apart. And so I'm sort of heavily caveating right now, because you look at anyone and it's like that's sort of very pithy, and it's sort of does it actually mean anything? And there are values I think companies have that are too far in that way. It's like inspire. It's like great. That's
what does that mean?
Great value. Innovate. Obviously.
Great.
And so like when we were looking at like values, I think we were quite intentional about how we would do it. And so there was like the timing was very important for us, first of all, which was, I think like the values that you have when you found a company, like the three of us, we had a set of values, but it's very easy for it to be very insular, because you sort of you've got the selection bias of like, I want to work with these people because I really like them and we work in a certain way. And that doesn't scale particularly well. So we weren't like, we're going to write down the values that we care about as a founding team. We were like, let's see how they get teased and sort of stretched and morphed a little bit by the people that we hire here. And so we were quite sort of like, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then, scale it sort of back at that point. And so we did do that, and kind of let the culture kind of be a little bit emergent, obviously with the guardrails and the kind of like trying to keep it where we kind of wanted it. And so that sort of went through it, and then we ended up doing like a process. I think it was like 18 months into the company, so like I think quite a long time by sort of company standards to sort of not have official values you could point at. We did like a process which was like a sort of top down, like founders, like given what we've seen now, how do we sort of want to articulate what we value as a company? And then you get the bottoms up, which is like, hey, well, we have a bunch of people here and they have their own perspectives, and sort of neither one is necessarily right, but you want to kind of find something that balances a bit of both. Like either way gets very wrong, right? Which like founders sort of tell everyone how they should act, and everyone's like, well, that's not how we do things, that's not going to work. And likewise, sort of similar thing for bottoms up. So that's how they sort of like came to be, and we landed on this set of 5 values that we have here. And so I guess to list them off like straight away, which is always the test, isn't it? Is like, can someone do it? So we have one which is raise the pace, which is like again like caveat on like don't tease it apart too much, but it's broadly like we care about things getting done really, really quickly here. Like it's one of our unique advantages is like, where a big incumbent is, has to run a big process to run and, introduce a new product feature, for example, because they are shackled by thousands of customers. Like We don't have that. We have, agility on our side. And so raise the pace is something that goes through product development, but it goes through sales. It's like, well, time kills deals. And so how do we make sure we get things done much, much faster? So a bunch of sort of like more context behind that. We have another one, which is find a way, which is, again, sort of, there are so many reasons that you start a startup and statistically you're going to fail, right? And so there is this kind of like, value of like, I guess, grit, determination, ability to sort of go and look at something that feels pretty intractable and go, well, I have to kind of have a bit of confidence and belief that this can be done, and sort of go through it like that. So like that's another one. We have another one which is make it magic, which is around essentially like, there often like there are very small things you can do in terms of time that have very outsized impact in sort of the way that they land. So this is everything from like product features, right? So it's like it's easy to build a product feature that kind of works. It's amazing to build one that has like a moment of delight. And that can be everything from like the most trite features, which is like you go through a setup wizard and you get confetti, right? Yeah. Super basic, right? But it's like, oh, that's cute. That's a nice thing. But it goes much, much deeper than that. And it's like everything that we build, we try and think about like what is the extra 5% we can do to turn that up to make this feel like a great product. And we see that coming back in all of the feedback we get of like, why did you choose us over N other people? And they're like, it just feels better. But it also flows through everything else. So it's like, customer success know that the person they're talking with has just had a baby. And it's like, well, we have a whole like stack of like baby gifts in the sort of the store cupboard, or we'll bespoke buy a gift, or someone has their 1,000th incident and we send them a cake to their office with like happy 1,000th incident kind of. And it's like, it's silly things.
And someone gets fired. No.
Yeah. Arguably like, small things, not much money, but have big impacts basically.
Yeah. I love it.
Fourth value, win together. So broadly, the kind of mindset here is deliberately try and blur the lines between what is your responsibility. So that there's other ways people phrase it, which is like nothing is not my responsibility or whatever else.
Yeah, nothing at Facebook is someone else's problem.
Yeah, exactly. And like I think this is maybe like a sub point of values, which is like they don't all have to be like super novel kind of things. I think it's like often the level below. But like I think ways we live this is, sales deals are not like sales go sell the thing. It's like when we are selling to someone, we will be like, right, well, this will have a customer success person from really early on. It will have an engineer who is there, who will be like the direct line in that deal, continuity with them. Again, a little bit of a make it magic moment where, they get to give feedback and we'll ship things within hours to sort of delight and things like that. And so everyone is doing the heavy lifting of like sales. And so products, we're often thinking about like, well, what can we build that would help our sales team to land the product even better? But it runs through a bunch of other things that happen there. I've done four of them. The final one, now this is the controversial one. So the final value we have is trust by default. And this is one I think is actually a mistake that we made, where that process of top down and bottoms up. The top-down version was, as founders, we were like, we want this default transparency value. We think we live it already. It's already happening. It's something we care about. It's useful to be able to point at it. So when someone creates a private channel, we can go, that's kind of not how we do things here. So unless there's a good reason, let's default transparency. The bottoms-up flow was, I think there was a bit of like, we had a big hiring sort of spell, a lot of new people, probably landing in a similar position to how I was when I landed at Monzo, which is like, this feels a bit uncomfortable. And it feels like essentially like the negative interpretation of that transparency value is like, people want to spy on me. People don't trust me. And so the kind of the articulation we kind of got from workshopping it bottoms up was like, trust by default is the thing that we want. And it turns out like that is obviously an enduring thing, a thing you want to have in an organization, but it doesn't get used anywhere.
So what does it mean? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is broadly the kind of principle that I think there are some places where you like earn trust over time, right? So you land at a company and you're like, right, your default trust level is maybe 0, right? Okay. And you build it up over time and you go, yeah, I know that Josh is a really good guy and like everything I give him becomes better, And here it is more of a kind of like, so early days, and we've changed this now, but we used to give everyone a literal physical credit card they could use to expense all of their own things. Didn't scale super well, but like that was an early days thing where it was like we trust everyone to like we don't need to be like checking and your manager to sign off on your expenses if you want to go and grab coffee with a teammate or you want to buy your own equipment for home, you just do that and that's fine. And there were a few things there, and it's essentially like your trust level starts at a 10.
Yeah.
And it's like it stays there. And that's the hope, is that everyone stays at like high trust environment. Like you have a lot of autonomy, you can make more decisions yourself, that sort of thing. And the way is down essentially if it doesn't go right, and that doesn't happen often, but that would be a thing that goes. So broadly, that's it. But I think by virtue of like how I've just articulated it, I think it's very hard, and I don't think it gets lived. And so I think that is one that I think there is a point, not just in future, where I just, as a founding team, we pull the lever and go, no, this is actually
time to change it.
It's time to change it.
You think you'd go to transparency?
Yeah, I do.
Go back to that.
I just feel it's like it's an act. Basically, all of our values were quite active, and the good example of like how we actually know that is we have like, I built a Zapier thing, right, which is like we have a bunch of, all the values are emoji inside of our Slack workspace, and people will reply to, react to certain messages and be like, oh, raise the pace, like someone did something faster than we possibly thought we could, or
reward the behavior.
And what it does is it then posts that into a channel, a values channel, so it's like you get to see the pulse of like people actually doing these things, and it dumps it in a spreadsheet, so I can sort of be like, how are the values all kind of weighing up, kind of thing. Trust by default, never been used. It's like, which makes sense, right? It's not like
what you're going to
reply. It's not like,
to.
Josh, that's so trust. It's like so that's sort of a thing. I think I want our values to be active, and
that's quite a nice measure, isn't it? Is it something that you could acknowledge someone did? Can you reward the behavior of the value? And if not, maybe it's not a great value. That could be like a decent litmus test.
I think it is. I think it's like, if you look at what values are intended to do, it's to like shape the way that people act and behave inside of a company. And I think if they are active and they do that, and you can sort of see it and reward it, that is a good sort of heuristic that it is a good living thing, I think.
Yeah, this is definitely going to be a short we clip out of this to promote the video. I think I think that's a really great moment. Awesome. Okay, so I've done quite a lot of these, and there's definitely a lot of common patterns across them. I love raise the pace. In fact, that was the majority of the conversation I had with Alicia here at Incident. She talked a lot about. I think that's what she was talking about at API World, where I saw her present, and where we met. Super common. Find a way reminds me of my old manager VJ. He was the first Studio Z guest. He was like, I think it's exactly the same thing. He used to say actually something along those lines. Just, you just find a way through.
Nice.
Which also sounds a little bit like Tom at Monzo and his feeling about these regulations. It's like people would come to him with obstacles that in reality weren't. There's like a way through them, and just do the work. Read the regulations,
grit,
etc.
determination.
Think of it creatively. I love that. And actually, I don't know if you've seen this, but Mr. Beast's the YouTuber.
Oh yeah, my kids know Mr. Beast.
Yeah. Well, his production team onboarding guide just leaked, and it is a fascinating one for if you're making YouTube videos. It's pretty interesting techniques, but really it's a management document about how he manages team. And I think there's two things that come through that I just hear from everybody. One is like move with a tremendous sense of urgency and a serious sense of ownership about what you're working on. You know? So I recommended read for folks if you can find it. The one that really stands out for me from you folks that's novel and I really like is the make it magic. And this idea of going 5% further reminds me a little bit of Brian Chesky from an Airbnb. Have you heard of his 7-star hotel?
I have, exactly.
8-star experience and how you keep building it up. But one of the downsides of this is I think it's very hard to measure the impact of this extra work you're doing. So how do you stop, teams perhaps abusing this? Or how do you manage what that looks like? Are you happy for your team if you're the chief product officer, right? So you're sort of the guy kind of in charge of prioritization, maybe. How do you feel if someone spends a week building a new confetti thing that just went too far? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really good.
It's a terrible example I gave though. Maybe you've got a real one of someone going too far. I don't know.
Yeah, I actually don't think we do, and I think this is where maybe actually the trust by default type of thing is the kind of the counterbalance to this, which is sort of trust that everyone is adult and able to make good, sensible decisions there. And if they're not, there's a transparent angle, which is well, we can communicate what we're doing. And it's if someone was I'm going to buy someone a Tesla because, when I make it magic for them, obviously it'd be great, well, maybe let's not do that kind of thing. So that is, I think the thing. But I think the broader point is how do we measure it? And is it good? And I think that's something that a lot of businesses get hung up on is it has to be measured to be able to be quantified. And I've been running marketing at this company now for a year, and fortunately won't have to do it for much longer because we've just hired someone amazing. But I think of it very similar to like brand investments, right? Which is like there's a ton of stuff that you do in marketing that has no kind of direct quantifiable ROI, right?
Yep.
I spend a bunch of time on certain things that just don't have any kind of like, there's no dollars tied to it.
Yep.
But you do it because it feels good. And there's that sort of like, I don't know, it's the vibe, right? And vibe is a word that gets used a lot around here, which is like I kind of trust that there are certain things, as long as you are pragmatic with what the inputs are, that the outputs will come at some later date, right? And so like, having a strong brand as a company isn't something that gives you immediate ROI, but over the long term, that is the kind of stuff where, people will go, well, I've heard of them, I've seen them, and I've done the thing, and therefore, I have some further down the line thing. And I think the same is true of like Make It Magic, which is like, us sending a cake to someone, they're not spending more money with us, but when it comes to a renewal and they're like, oh, this is one of the best vendors I work with. And in fact, we had some feedback from one of our customers, in fact it was Etsy, and they were like, this is literally the most successful vendor relationship that we have ever had. And that is not just the product, that is the product of
the relationship,
the relationship and the everything, and we'll get on planes and we'll go and see people, and we will, it's all of those sorts of things. And so basically I see enough evidence in the outputs, albeit lagging, that I have high confidence that it is a worthwhile kind of input value for us to sort of to push.
It's interesting. It reminds me, so a couple of things it makes me think of is they used to be saying if you ask for 5-star, you'll get 3. So, you need to set like the bar really high. And I like the idea that if your team is sort of encouraged, just on a product perspective now, not the sending cakes thing, which is, I think is another example of this. But when they're building product, if they're kind of encouraged to go further and like the confetti or like these other, little gems or eggs that you place in the product, it automatically suggests that, to get to that point, the core product itself has got to be great. You're not going to stop. You're not going to be cutting corners. Like it just sort of sets a bar of general excellence. From what I've seen, like your UI and your website's all very beautiful. Your office is stunning.
Yep.
And I think there's sort of just a culture here around that. It reminds me a lot of Stripe. And Patrick Collison, the CEO there, did a tweet recently that I really liked, where he talked about the importance of sort of experience. I think he talked about visual beauty in a product is a strong indicator of the craft that went into it. Like people like using beautiful products, not just because they're pretty to look at, but it's an indicator that the back end, the whole thing is probably thought through
100%.
and cared for, and the people working on it like really care and really give a damn. And that probably shows up if you're sending cakes and you're, these guys, these folks, they really care about what they're doing and how they deliver their service. And that might manifest in me getting a cake, which is, nice. But in reality, it's a solid product, it's a solid team, they're responsive, and they're gonna care about me. So I think going that step further, it just like shows up in everything you do.
Yeah, and I think that the really, really important point is it's not do we build great product or do we sort of do the delightful confetti, right? We keep anchoring to that. It's that there is more than confetti.
Hopefully
in the
not.
product.
Yeah.
But it is like, I think it is the sort of the tip of the iceberg that gives you confidence that this is a company that cares. And I think the care, you sort of like transitively apply that to all the other interaction points you have, which is again why like brand is so important, because it's like if a company it cares about how it's perceived in the world, then that I trust that flows through, not just like it's not a marketing website, it is all the various things that sit behind that. So yeah, I think it's a good point.
Okay, so when we met and chatted last time, there was a slightly spicy topic we got into. Not too spicy.
I'm trying to remember what I said.
It
now.
was bottoms up. Okay. Is bottoms up a good? Is bottoms up a good idea?
Yeah.
And I think your response included a profanity that we'll probably keep out for now. That it was BS.
Yes.
But then obviously but look. Let's just talk about bottoms up versus top down and how you feel about it. I'm just going to leave you at that and see what you got to say.
Yes. Yeah, I think the when we spoke previously, it was like in the context of how we define the values, like going bottoms up, top down type thing. And I think, I think I described trust by default as a bullshit value, and I think it's true. And I just think it's like if you look at incentives and you look at how things sort of come to be, right? I often think about like problems in like, are you locally optimizing or are you globally optimizing? And I think that is a really interesting lens to apply to pretty much every problem in a business, which is, as someone founding a business, you are very rarely locally optimizing. You are optimizing for like, what do I think is right for this business as a whole? And that means essentially taking all of the kind of input from all the various things and trying to find the thing that is the right thing for the company. And so when we're defining values, like that's how we came into that process.
Yeah, okay.
And I think you get people who are sort of individual contributors or people throughout the company, and when they're thinking about these things, and I don't mean this like overly reductively. I think we have really smart people here who do think outside of their own sphere.
Yep.
But the bias and the pull of an individual whenever you're doing anything bottoms up and sort of like giving that kind of feedback is very much like, what is my worldview, and what do I want to apply on that? And so I think that's probably what led us astray a little bit here. And it's a kind of tricky problem to navigate, I think.
Well, but as CPO, how does that? I'll give an example. So I've sort of seen both worlds at both extremes. When I was at Microsoft, I think it's changed a little now. I was there mostly in the Ballmer era. That was quite a top-down company. There was essentially like a VP that would decide the vision. It was like a set of scaffolding, and people were like placed into the scaffolding. And if you removed a person, like not much changed. There was just a plan being executed. To the point where some of the VPs would be like deciding the colors of the buttons, and there wasn't much passed down. I know it's changed a lot since then. Then I went to Facebook, which was really quite different. Actually, it was much larger, not the original Facebook. So Mark just couldn't have his fingers in everything. But teams were often really just kind of given a rough mandate of what they were going to go and do, and then it's like almost like an investment model where I've given you 20 engineers, what cool things are you going to do with them, and how are you going to add value to the business? So it was quite bottoms up. And so I enjoy sort of understanding how do you run product here? Like, how much do you have things come from the individuals working on the team that come up versus this top-down vision and decision-making you're driving? Like, how do you run the product prioritization?
Yeah, I mean, this is incredibly pertinent because I've literally immediately before speaking to you, I was working with all of our product managers on Q4 plans.
Gotcha.
And so a mixture, honestly, is how it works. So I think if you look at context is a really interesting word, right? Which is like, it's a bit of a privilege to be at the top of a company because you have all of the context. I remember, I think it was one of the co-founders at Monzo used to say, it's like, context is a privilege, right?
Yeah.
You should recognize that, which is like when you go into a conversation, you're like, I can't believe Josh made that decision. You're like, I wouldn't have made that decision. But it's like, I wouldn't have made the decision because I know that this team here and this team here are doing X, Y, and Z and all those sorts of things. And so that is something where I think it's really, really important to have that top down. So if I look at our product planning process, for example, we spent as a founding team and one of our investors who's like, honestly great, super hands-on, sort of knows the space, spent an entire day thinking about, big swings, right? And this is where we get to sort of do the lofty, I'm a founder and I'm unshackled by the realities of people and constraints and all that sort of stuff. Like, what would we build? What could we build? What would be great for the market? All of those sorts of things. And so we do that kind of process on a sort of regular thing. And that's the kind of tension, I think, that expands the mindset of the people in the company, which is like, hey, well, let's assume that you had millions more dollars to spend on people and all these sorts of things, and we can sort of think bigger a little bit. And then we take that, and then the product teams, they also have a bunch of context. They do a lot of work with our sales teams and GTM teams, and so they have context of like, well, this customer has this thing that they desperately need. We have this prospect that will sign if we build this thing, and we also have our own great ideas because we have the context of being closer to this domain than you are as founders. And so I think that you get this like healthy then collision in the middle. And so that's broadly where we were at today. So this week I spent a bunch of session time with our product managers being like, here is my thoughts from sort of top down. I want you to take that away and come back with the kind of, here is our rough stack rank of what we think, factoring in all these things that we should do. And that was where we had the big session this morning. And that's sort of like, I guess like
the session was like smashing out the winners and losers, or
it was mostly a kind of teasing at the kind of, it was like basically like here is our replay of given everything we think we can do, what is in for Q4, and explicitly then what is out for Q4.
Got it.
And I think that second part is really interesting too when it comes to product, which is like people often talk about like, here's what we're going to do, and I think often the interesting bits are like, have you made really, really clear the trade-offs of what you're not going to do? And so that tends to be the conversation of like, hang on, you've put that thing out, and I know that there's a X 100K deal that is hanging on that thing that came about over the last couple of days, and it's like we need to bump that in. And so it's that kind of thing that happens there. So I think it's a really healthy tension that happens. And as I said, like that is like the first pass of this stuff is that, and then we'll go and talk to other people, and we'll see how it survives concept reality. And then when we start building these things, there is like another collision of like, so we put a feature in the roadmap, and then but when it comes to actually building, it'll be like the design team will work in Figma and be like, this is how we think it will look, and there'll be a bit of like commenting and back and forth and collaboration. And so I think it's like, it's not a sort of one and done and like set the guardrails up and let the ball roll down the alley or whatever your kind of metaphor is. But it's like constantly that feedback of like colliding those two worlds in a good way. And I think there's good and bad ways. I've seen really bad ways where that's like, overly micromanaged is the sort of the natural failure point, which is like
founder mode.
Exactly. We can throw that at anything these days. It's great. I've just been using it for all my excuses. But no, it's like I think it is, again, like without sort of laboring the values, that sort of trust sort of basis is a good one here, which is like that people trust that I can bring something good to a conversation that will help them build stronger product, and I trust that they have a bunch of ideas of things I've never even thought about because they're doing 40 hours a week thinking about the specific thing that they're thinking about. So I don't know. It feels. I think we're in a good cadence. Like always looking to try and improve things when it comes to like product and shipping things and reducing scope. That's another thing that I often will bring to the table, which is that they're like, we're going to build a thing that's going to take us 4 weeks, and I'll be like, what would we build if we only had 2? And often that's a really fun thing to do as a founder, which is like, it's almost meme worthy with Pete, my co-founder, which is like, he's just like, how can we do it in half the time?
Yeah.
And it's like, people will be like, well, we could do it, but we'd have to not do this. And he's like, I'm okay with you not doing that.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh, well, I didn't realize that. And so that's like, all these kind of conversations. And again, like transparency, it's like bring all these things to the fore, and it helps you like navigate these kind of situations.
It's really funny how all the best teams have all these same ideas that, they feel local. Like, it's a big thing of VJs, like just do less, The longer, the bigger a project, the more likely it is to fail. It's like the simple outcome, like break it down.
100%. We had in the early days of building this company, we had a customer asked for private incidents, right? Which is like, I want to be able to declare an incident that you explicitly have to be invited to. So our default mode of building incidents in the early days was everything was public. So public channels, you declare a thing, we're like, it's great. Everyone should know about incidents in an organization. And this customer came along and had obviously a very clear use case and a good use case for this. I remember the team, we punted it, and we were like, it's really big, really complicated, lots of security, gnarly things, we want to get it right. Anyway, we got to the point where we need to build it, and the team, we sort of sat down, we were like, right, well, what's the scope of this thing? And we sort of like hashed it out, and we sort of like pulled away, and we're like, actually, we don't need that bit, and we don't need that bit, we don't need that bit. Then we got to the end, like, yeah, but this is only going to take us a week now. But sort of said in a kind of like, we've made it too simple. It's like, no, it's perfect.
It's got to work the problem sometimes.
Exactly. And I think it's, I think it's like, reduction in scope is always a fun thing to think about.
It's funny. I think there's a saying in software engineering, right? The cache invalidation and naming are the 2 hardest problems.
Yeah.
It's not. It's prioritization in my book. Like, it's clearly that is the hardest thing. And there's a saying I love now, which I always sort of use as a test. I think it came from Amy Vora at Facebook, she's at another company, Alfair. It's not prioritization if it doesn't hurt.
Yes.
And I feel like if you come away from a prioritization session and you're not all gutted that you didn't do this feature, you haven't prioritized.
Yeah.
You've just like spread the butter so thin over the toast. Like, it's got to feel painful if you prioritize.
And that's a very, very sort of real for us, which is like we have part of the really tight relationship we have with customers is that like we build lots of things for them and we have that relationship, and it's hard, right? When you get to it, they're like, this is the thing that is most important to me, and you're like, but it's only important to them.
You're right.
And so I like either me or Pete are the people who have to go and have those conversations and say, listen, I totally understand it, and it's not a commentary on like, how much we value you as a customer, but like, we can't build this now because you're the only person who wants it, and we're trying to sort of globally optimize across all customers, kind of thing. And so like, it's painful all the time in that front. But the right kind of pain, I think.
Okay, last question actually. Whilst we brought it up, I'm gonna ask for your reaction to founder mode and what your take was. So you heard about this thing from
Paul Graham's thing.
Let's just explain it. So this is Paul Graham of YC fame. Had observed a bit of a pattern. I think Chesky again from Airbnb did an interview with like Larry. What's he called? Lenny, the podcast
the product
guy.
Lenny, I can't remember.
We'll add the link below. Sorry, Lenny, we can't remember your last name. And talked about Brian's switch from sort of delegating everything, which investors and so on had told him to do. He should do less of a thing, saying, but actually turned out this is what I was good at. And so he got much more back in the weeds and was really much more involved in all of the details. Becomes a bit of a conversation of like, is he saying he's becoming a micromanager? But that this was a thing that Paul sort of saw in successful companies, is that the founders stayed really engaged in a lot of details and were kind of involved throughout the org chart. You think that's a fair summary? Would you add anything or change anything?
No, I think that's a fair summary. I think that's pretty accurate.
What's your take?
I think 2 things. I'll expand on both. First is sort of, I think, very accurate, and I see it day in, day out. I see places where we've made mistakes where we have, not done that, and we tried to do the sort of typical org model. And the other thing is, I think it has sort of almost become a bit meme-worthy, which is just like, because it's actually a little bit unspecific in cases. Yeah, it's a little bit unspecific in cases. So it's like, it's like the get out clause for any kind of erratic behavior from a founding team is like, founder mode. But to the main point, I think founders, when they're building their company, have a really good nose for what is good, what is bad, and that flows everything from like the domain, but how the company should be run, and all those sorts of things. And in fact, I heard a podcast with Owen McCabe from Intercom, who famously left Intercom and then went back, and it was all about how he kind of was like had this kind of renewed confidence of like this is how I want my company to be run, and it was sort of like, I guess, like an extreme version of founder mode, and super smart guy. But I think we've made mistakes in the past with this, which is like especially in like domains that we are not familiar with, which is like sales, for example. Like we're all technical way background, right? We've never done sales, and so we hired a sales leader, and we were like, this is great, this is your ship now, good luck. And we were like, watch the results, and then things didn't work out, and it wasn't in a good shape, and then suddenly you're like, well, there's a lot of things that are happening here that I actually have like a good opinion on, and I don't need to be a sales leader, I don't need to be an expert to have an opinion on it, or at least to be able to be involved in sort of teasing at the discussions and things there. And I think it's sort of like, I don't know, my view of this is like a sort of a bit like trust but verify type thing. And I think as a founder who is like ultimately, I see my job as like ultimately responsible for making sure that everyone at this company does phenomenally well in the long run, which is like, and that we build a great product and do all those sorts of things. And I think that sort of earns you the right to go in and be able to go and talk to anyone without it feeling like you're overstepping a mark, or you've had to delegate a certain function to someone, or like, hey, you're the CPO, so a CPO should only really interact at this level, but like, I comfortably will go and sit with an engineer or a designer on a Figma file for a whole time. And like all of this is a slightly moot because we're like an 80-person company, and so you don't have to have big divisions and stuff. But I will absolutely look to retain, I think, a lot of that involvement as we grow. And so that's I buy it. I don't want to get to a world where it is like black boxes for different parts of the org. I want to be in the weeds as much as reasonably possible. Yeah, makes sense. So founder mode, generally a good thing, but obviously don't use it as an excuse where you can be abused effectively. I think so, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Chris, this was great. Thanks so much. I think it was a really good conversation, and really enjoyed chatting with you. Folks, subscribe. We've got more great guests coming to Studio Z. Make sure to like and give us a comment on the video. What's your thoughts on founder mode, on the other topics we talked about, bottoms up versus tops down? Let us know. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for having me.